Chapter 10 The Storyteller. The unique feature of the children in the train carriage is the curiosity which leads them to creatively imagine a strange and unusual garden. It was a hot afternoon, and the railway carriage was stuffy and humid. The next stop was at Templecombe, nearly an hour ahead. The occupants of the carriage were a smaller girl, and a small boy. An aunt belonging to the children occupied one corner seat, and the further corner seat on the opposite side was occupied by a bachelor unknown to them. The aunt and the children were engaged in short repeated conversations. Most of the aunt's remarks seemed to begin with "don't," and nearly all of the children's remarks began with "why." "Don't, Cyril, don't!" exclaimed the aunt, as the small boy began smacking the cushions of the seat, producing a cloud of dust at each blow. "Come and look out of the window," she added. The child moved reluctantly to the window. "Why are those sheep being driven out of that field?" he asked. "I expect they are being driven to another field where there is more grass," said the aunt weakly. "But there is lots of grass in that field," protested the boy. "There's nothing else but grass there." "Aunt, there's lots of grass in that field." "Perhaps the grass in the other field is better," suggested the aunt, feeling quite silly. "Why is it better?" Swiftly came the next question. "Oh, look at those cows!" exclaimed the aunt. Nearly every field along the line had cows or bullocks, but she spoke as though she were drawing attention to something rare. "Why is the grass in the other field better?" persisted Cyril. The frown on the bachelor's face was deepening to a scowl. He was a hard, unsympathetic man, the aunt decided in her mind. She was utterly unable to come to any satisfactory answer about the grass in the other field. The smaller girl distracted everyone by beginning to recite "On the Road to Mandalay." She only knew the first line, and repeated the line over and over again in a dreamy but very audible voice. It seemed to the bachelor as though someone had a bet with her that she could not repeat the line aloud 2,000 times without stopping. Whoever it was who had made the bet was likely to lose. "Come over here and listen to a story," said the aunt, when she saw the bachelor still frowning. The children groaned and moved listlessly towards the aunt's end of the carriage. Evidently, the children did not rank her high in the art of storytelling. In a low, confidential voice, interrupted at frequent intervals by loud, childish questionings from her listeners, she began a dreadfully uninteresting story about a little girl who was good and made friends with everyone on account of her goodness, and was finally saved from a mad bull by a number of rescuers who admired her good character. "Wouldn't they have saved her if she hadn't been good?" demanded the bigger of the small girls. It was exactly the question that the bachelor had wanted to ask. "Well, yes," admitted the aunt lamely, "but I don't think they would have run quite so fast to her help if they had not liked her so much." "It's the stupidest story I have ever heard," said the bigger of the small girls. "I didn't listen after the first bit. It was so stupid," said Cyril. The smaller girl made no comment on the story, for she too showed least interest at what her aunt was saying. "You don't seem to be a success as a storyteller," said the bachelor suddenly from his corner. The aunt retorted in instant defense at this unexpected remark. "It's a very difficult thing to tell stories that children can both understand and appreciate," she said stiffly. "I don't agree with you," said the bachelor. "Perhaps you would like to tell them a story?" was the aunt's sharp reply. "Tell us a story," demanded the bigger of the small girls. The bachelor nodded. Once upon a time, he began, there was a little girl called Bertha who was extraordinarily good. The children's interest aroused momentarily, but died just as soon. All stories seemed terribly alike, no matter who told them. She did all that she was told. She was always truthful. She kept her clothes clean, ate milk puddings as though they were jam tarts, learned her lessons perfectly, and was polite in her manners. Was she pretty? Asked the bigger of the small girls. Not as pretty as any of you, said the bachelor, but she was horribly good. There was a nod in favor of the story. The word horrible in connection with goodness was a novelty liked by the children. It seemed to have an element of reality that was absent from the aunt's tales. She was so good, continued the bachelor, that she won several medals for goodness, which she always wore pinned onto her dress. There was a medal for obedience, another medal for punctuality, and a third for good behavior. They were large metal medals, and they clicked against one another as she walked. No other child in the town where she lived had as many medals, so everybody knew that she must be an extra good child. Horribly good, quoted Cyril. Everybody talked about her goodness, and the prince of the country got to hear about it, and he said that as she was so very good, she might be allowed once a week to walk in his park, which was just outside the town. It was a beautiful park, and no child was ever allowed in it, so it was a great honor for Bertha to be allowed to go there. Were there any sheep in the park? Demanded Cyril. No, said the bachelor. There were no sheep. Why weren't there any sheep? Quipped Cyril. The aunt smiled to herself. In fact, it was almost a grin. No, there were no sheep in the park, said the bachelor, but there were lots of little pigs running all over the place. The aunt covered her mouth and suppressed a gasp of admiration. What color were they? Black with white faces, white with black spots, black all over, gray with white patches, and some were white all over. The storyteller paused to let the full idea of the park's treasures sink into the children's imaginations. Then he resumed. Bertha was rather sorry to find that there were no flowers in the park. She had promised her aunt, with tears in her eyes, that she would not pick any of the kind princess flowers, and she had meant to keep her promise, so of course it made her feel silly to find that there were no flowers to pick. Why weren't there any flowers? Because the pigs had eaten them all, said the bachelor promptly. The gardeners had told the prince that you couldn't have pigs and flowers, so he decided to have pigs and no flowers. There were a murmur of approval from the girls at the prince's decision. There were lots of other delightful things in the park. There were ponds with gold and blue and green fish in them, and trees with beautiful parrots that said clever things at a moment's notice, and hummingbirds that hummed all the popular tunes of the day. Bertha walked up and down and enjoyed herself immensely, and thought to herself, if I were not so extraordinarily good, I should not have been allowed to come into this beautiful park and enjoy all that there is to be seen in it. And her 3 medals clinked against one another as she walked and helped to remind her how very good she really was. Just then, an enormous wolf came prowling into the park to see if it could catch a fat little pig for its supper. What color was it? Asked the children, showing interest at the turn of events. Mud color all over, with a black tongue and a pale grey eyes that gleamed with ferocity. The first thing that it saw in the park was Bertha. Her pinafore was so spotlessly white and clean that it could be seen from a great distance. Bertha saw the wolf too. It was stealing towards her, and she began to wish that she had never been allowed to come into the park. She ran as hard as she could, and the wolf came after her with huge leaps and bounds. She managed to hide herself in a thick myrtle bush. The wolf came sniffing among the branches, its black tongue lolling out of its mouth, and its pale grey eyes glaring with rage. Bertha was terribly frightened. If only I had not been so extraordinarily good, I should have been safe in the town at this moment, she thought. Bertha was trembling very much at having the wolf prowling and sniffing so near her, and as she trembled, the medal for obedience clinked against the medals for good conduct and punctuality. The wolf heard the sound of the medals clinking and stopped to listen. They clinked again in a bush quite near him. He dashed into the bush, his pale grey eyes gleaming with triumph, and dragged Bertha out and devoured her to the last morsel. All that was left of her were her shoes, bits of clothing, and the 3 medals for goodness. Were any of the little pigs killed? No. They all escaped. The story began badly, said the smaller of the small girls, but it had a beautiful ending. It is the most beautiful story that I ever heard, said the bigger of the small girls. It is the only beautiful story I have ever heard, said Cyril. A different opinion came from the aunt. The most improper story to tell young children. You have undermined the effect of years of careful teaching. At any rate, said the bachelor, collecting his belongings and preparing to leave the carriage. I kept them quiet for 10 minutes, which was more than you were able to do. The old woman smirked. Unhappy woman, he murmured to himself as he walked down the platform of Templecombe